The Nova research facility sat beneath miles of ice, its isolation a testament to the secrets it housed. A labyrinth of sterile corridors and echoing chambers, the facility was designed for a single purpose: to study the anomalies that could change humanity's understanding of the universe. In Lab Theta 7, the most secure wing of the compound, 6 scientists stood on the precipice of what they believed would be their greatest discovery. Shard 9 rested in a reinforced containment sphere, its smooth obsidian surface defying light. It shimmered faintly, its edges soft and ill-defined, as though it were slipping between dimensions. This artifact, found embedded in the crust of a forgotten moon, had defied every attempt at classification. It radiated energy signatures unrecognizable by human instruments, and deep within its structure, telescopic imaging had revealed something astonishing: a miniature universe. Dr. Elias Voss stared at the object, his fingers twitching at his sides. A tall man with prematurely silvered hair, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to success, but his sharp eyes betrayed an undercurrent of desperation. He had spent years chasing a theory no one else had dared to believe. Now, the culmination of that obsession glimmered before him. "It's a self-contained universe," he said, his voice low but commanding. "Do you understand what that means? It's creation. Creation in our hands." Dr. Lydia Keene, standing to his right, frowned as she adjusted her lab coat. "We're still not sure it's stable, Elias. The energy spikes have been increasing. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong if we stick to the plan." Elias cut her off, stepping closer to the console that controlled the experiment. His words silenced the room, but the tension remained palpable. Behind him, Raj Patel and the Ruiz twins exchanged uneasy glances. Only Sophia Kane, who sat at a terminal, seemed unaffected, her gaunt face lit by the glow of the monitors. The plan was deceptively simple on paper. Use quantum tunneling to breach the surface of Shard 9 and deploy nanoprobes into its interior. If successful, the probes would map the universe inside, transmitting data back to the team. Every calculation had been checked, every variable accounted for. Yet the unpredictable nature of Shard 9 loomed over them like a shadow. "Power levels are steady," Raj announced, his voice wavering slightly. "Initializing Phase 1. A hum filled the air as the containment sphere began to glow. Lines of light traced the surface of Shard 9, forming intricate geometric patterns that pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm. The room seemed to shrink around them, the weight of the moment pressing down like a physical force. Gabriel Ruiz broke the silence, his voice tight. "Anyone else getting the feeling this thing doesn't like what we're doing?" "Don't anthropomorphize it," Marcus snapped, his twin's tension mirroring his own. "It's not alive." "Are you sure about that?" Gabriel shot back. "Enough," Lydia hissed, her eyes locked on the object. The geometric patterns were accelerating, their glow intensifying. "Elias, it's reacting." "Good. That means it's working," Elias said, his hands moving over the console with practiced precision. He felt a rush of exhilaration, a sense of triumph that drowned out the unease in the room. For the first time, the impossible seemed within reach. Then the reading spiked. Sophia was the first to notice, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. "Elias," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "Energy output just tripled. This isn't—" The lab lights flickered and a high-pitched whine filled the air. The containment sphere vibrated violently, the geometric patterns warping and bleeding into chaotic shapes. Alarms blared, a cacophony of shrill warnings that sent the team into a frenzy. "Shut it down," Lydia shouted, but her words were lost in the noise. "No," Elias barked, his hands gripping the console as he adjusted the power levels. "We're too close." The whine grew into a deafening roar, and for a moment the room was consumed by blinding light. When it cleared, everything was silent. Shard 9 no longer shimmered. Its surface was matte black, its glow extinguished, but it was no longer the same size. The object had grown, its dimensions now larger than the containment sphere that held it. Worse, its surface seemed to ripple, as if alive. The team stared in stunned silence. Then the first distortion appeared. A small toolbox on Raj's workstation slid several inches on its own, the motion subtle but unmistakable. Gabriel opened his mouth to speak, but his words came out distorted, his voice stretching unnaturally like a recording played at the wrong speed. "What just happened?" Lydia whispered, her voice trembling. Elias said nothing. His hands gripped the console as he stared at Shard 9, his face pale. For the first time, doubt crept into his eyes. He had been so certain, so sure of his calculations, but the object before him defied everything he thought he knew. In the silence, the object began to pulse, its surface undulating like a living thing. Then came the sound, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the core of Shard 9. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, deliberate. It sounded like a heartbeat. The first signs were subtle, almost easy to dismiss. Raj Patel noticed his tools shifting when he wasn't looking, just a slight nudge here or there. It wasn't until he caught a wrench sliding across the table on its own, leaving a faint trail in the black residue that clung to every surface, that he realized something was wrong. The others dismissed it. Stress, they said, or maybe his imagination playing tricks after the failed experiment. But Raj knew what he saw. That night, as he lay on the cot in his quarters, he swore he heard whispers outside his door, faint and distant, like voices carried on the wind. Yet the air in the Nova research facility was as still as death. By the third day, no one could deny that something had gone terribly wrong. Time itself seemed fractured, clocks no longer aligned, with each room displaying a different hour. Simple tasks became labyrinthine. A trip to the storage bay took minutes for one person, but stretched into hours for another. The corridors seemed to shift subtly, their angles bending in ways that made no architectural sense. What once was a straight walk to the control room now felt like navigating a maze. It wasn't just the building, the distortions affected them too. Sophia Kane was the first to notice changes in her body. She'd been scratching absent-mindedly at her hands when the skin began to peel away. Not with the rawness of a wound, but like shedding, revealing something unnatural beneath. Her veins, translucent and faintly glowing, pulsed with an unsettling rhythm. She wrapped her hands in gauze and kept quiet, too afraid to show the others. Gabriel Ruiz grew increasingly agitated. He claimed to hear voices, not the indistinct murmurs that haunted the others, but clear and deliberate words in a language none of them understood. At first, he thought it was a malfunction in the comms system, but when he ripped his earpiece out and the voices continued, panic set in. "It's in my head," he whispered to Lydia late one night, his bloodshot eyes darting nervously. "They're talking to me. I don't know what they want." "What's talking to you?" Lydia asked, but he couldn't explain. Every attempt to describe it only made his words falter, as though the act of speaking about it twisted the memory into something unrecognizable. Marcus Ruiz, ever the skeptic, refused to entertain the idea that anything was amiss beyond their own paranoia. He insisted they were experiencing collective stress from the experiment's failure. That certainty shattered the morning they found him in the lab, staring at his reflection in a steel panel, his face covered in a rash. The patterns etched into his skin were intricate and unmistakable. Spirals and fractals, shapes that mirrored the galaxies they'd seen swirling inside Shard 9. The black fluid was everywhere now. It seeped from vents, pooled in corners, and clung to the walls. When Gabriel attempted to sample it, his gloves dissolved on contact, the material fusing to his skin. He screamed as the flesh of his hand warped, twisting into something unrecognizable. Fingers elongated and blackened, the texture no longer human, but glossy and chitinous. He smashed his hand against the lab table in a frenzy, shattering bone in a desperate attempt to rid himself of the corruption. It didn't work. By the end of the day, the transformation had consumed his entire arm, the skin hardening into a shell-like material. The others watched in horror as he clawed at his face, his screams echoing through the facility. His body contorted unnaturally, his limbs folding and snapping as though guided by some external force. When the changes reached his chest, he collapsed, his breathing ragged. Then, silence. Raj disappeared next. His absence was abrupt and complete. One moment he was analyzing data in the lab, the next his workstation was empty, his chair overturned. When they searched for him, all they found was a slick trail of black fluid leading to the containment sphere. The surface of Shard 9 pulsed faintly, almost as if it were breathing. Lydia became increasingly desperate. She pored over the data, trying to make sense of the growing chaos. "It's connected to the breach," she told Elias, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "The moment we fractured Shard 9, we linked our reality to whatever's inside it. It's bleeding through." Elias stared at her, his jaw tight. The confident, calculating leader they had followed now seemed hollow, his face gaunt and pale. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned his gaze to the containment sphere, where Shard 9 loomed like an impossible black sun. Its surface had changed again, the ripples forming shapes that almost resembled faces, distorted and alien, but unmistakably watching them. The building itself seemed alive now. The walls pulsed faintly, the metallic surfaces damp and warm to the touch. Sometimes they felt the floors shift beneath their feet, as though the entire facility were breathing. Lydia swore she heard something moving inside the ventilation system, a soft, wet slithering that sent chills down her spine. Then Sophia began to change. The gauze around her hands had become soaked with blood, and when Lydia insisted on examining them, they were horrified to find her fingers fused together, her nails replaced by translucent claws. The veins beneath her skin glowed brighter now, coursing with a dark, viscous substance that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. "I can feel it inside me," Sophia said, her voice trembling. "It's spreading." The team was unraveling, their sanity fraying along with the fabric of reality itself. Elias retreated to his quarters, leaving Lydia and Marcus to handle the chaos. The containment sphere was no longer secure. The rippling surface of Shard 9 had begun to extend beyond its confines, threads of its essence creeping into the lab like tendrils. "What do we do?" Marcus asked one night, his voice barely a whisper. His rash had spread, the fractal patterns now curling around his neck like a noose. "How do we stop this?" Lydia didn't have an answer. All she knew was that Shard 9 had brought something with it, something they couldn't comprehend. And whatever it was growing stronger. The Nova research facility had become unrecognizable. The once sterile corridors were now overrun with black, pulsating growths that spread like veins across the walls and ceiling, throbbing faintly in time with the alien rhythm emanating from Shard 9. The air was heavy, thick with the metallic tang of blood, and something fouler, a rotting biological odor that seemed to ooze from every surface. The facility wasn't just decaying, it was transforming. Lydia and Marcus worked in silence, the faint glow of their terminals the only light in the lab. Sophia was gone. Her screams had echoed through the vents for hours before they stopped. Lydia tried not to think about what had become of her, but the images wouldn't leave her mind. Sophia's hands elongating into clawed appendages, her eyes darkening into pools of black, her voice garbled as her body twisted into something monstrous. Now it was just Lydia, Marcus, and Elias. Gabriel and Raj had disappeared days ago. Or was it hours? Time no longer held meaning in this fractured reality. The three remaining scientists knew the truth they couldn't say aloud. They were next. A sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like a distant whisper, but it grew louder, closer, a wet, slithering noise accompanied by the scrape of claws on metal. Lydia froze, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Marcus turned to her, his face pale, his breath shallow. "It's here," he mouthed. The slithering stopped, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. A shadow moved at the edge of the room, flickering in and out of sight like a bad signal. Lydia's heart pounded as she reached for the pistol strapped to her belt, a precaution Elias had insisted on, though none of them believed it would do much good. The shadow coalesced into a form, and for the first time, Lydia saw it. The creature was impossibly large, its body a grotesque amalgamation of flesh and stardust. Limbs twisted and shifted as though unsure of their shape, their surfaces shimmering like the fractured edge of a nebula. Its torso was covered in scales that pulsed faintly, each one glistening with a black, viscous fluid. Where a face should have been, there was only a void, its edges rippling like the surface of Shard 9. But the worst part was the sound. It wasn't a roar or a screech. It was a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to emanate from the creature's very core, a sound that bypassed the ears and settled in the bones. It was unbearable, a frequency that made Lydia's teeth ache and her vision blur. Marcus was the first to move. Gripping a metal rod, he swung at the creature with all his strength. The weapon connected, but instead of recoiling, the creature absorbed the blow. Its surface rippled, and before Marcus could react, a tendril shot out from its body, wrapping around his arm. He screamed as the tendril tightened, his skin bubbling and blackening as though burned by acid. "Marcus!" Lydia shouted, raising her pistol. She fired, the shots echoing in the lab. The bullets struck the creature's torso, but they had no effect. The creature's void-like face turned toward her, and she felt an overwhelming pressure in her skull, as though something was trying to pry her mind open. She staggered back, clutching her head. Marcus's screams stopped abruptly. Lydia looked up to see his body collapsing to the floor in a heap. His skin was gone, his muscles and bones fused into a grotesque, crystalline structure that pulsed faintly with the same rhythm as the creature. It was feeding on him, she realized, consuming him. She turned and ran. The halls of the facility were unrecognizable now, twisting and branching in ways that defied logic. Black tendrils snaked along the floor, grasping at her feet as she sprinted past. The hum of the creature followed her, growing louder, closer. She didn't dare look back. She found Elias in the central control room, his face illuminated by the flickering monitors. He didn't look up as she entered, his attention fixed on the data streaming across the screens. "It's adapting," he said, his voice eerily calm. "The more it consumes, the stronger it gets. We've unleashed something we can't stop." "We have to destroy Shard 9, Lydia panted, her chest heaving. "It's the source. It's not that simple." Elias finally turned to her, his eyes hollow. "Shard 9 isn't just a container. It's a bridge. Destroying it might not stop this. It might make it worse." Lydia slammed her hands on the console. "Worse than this? Look around, Elias. There's nothing left to save." Before he could respond, the creature's hum filled the room. The lights flickered and the tendrils began to seep through the vents, curling toward them like living smoke. Elias grabbed a nearby wrench and turned to face the door, his expression grim. "We don't have time to argue," he said. "We make our stand here." The creature entered, its massive form filling the doorway. Lydia raised her pistol again, knowing it was futile. The creature stepped forward, its shifting limbs dragging across the floor, leaving a trail of glistening black fluid. It towered over them, its void-like face tilting as if to study them. Then it lunged. Elias swung the wrench, striking the creature's limb. It recoiled slightly, but a tendril lashed out, wrapping around his neck. Lydia fired shot after shot, but the bullets did nothing. The tendrils lifted Elias into the air, his body convulsing as the creature began to absorb him. "Lydia," he choked out, his voice strained. "Do it. Destroy it." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the console that would overload the containment systems. The facility would be destroyed, but so would Shard 9, and maybe, just maybe, the creature. Elias's screams filled the room, and Lydia made her choice. The control room was bathed in an ominous red glow. Emergency lights pulsed in sync with the low, guttural hum of the creature, whose vast, shifting form filled the shattered doorway. Lydia's breaths came in ragged gasps as she stared at the console, her fingers trembling above the controls that would seal all their fates. Behind her, Elias dangled in the creature's grasp, his body convulsing as its tendrils burrowed into his skin, merging with his flesh. The creature fed on him, consuming not just his body but something deeper. His eyes rolled back, his face frozen in a mask of anguish. "Do it!" Elias's voice, barely human now, ripped through the air. His words were raw, strangled, as though forced through a throat that no longer belonged to him. "End this," Lydia's hand faltered. Tears blurred her vision as she glanced at him, at the man who had driven them here, who had dragged them all into this abyss. His obsession with Shard 9 had destroyed them, but now, in his final moments, he seemed fragile, human again. She could hear his labored breathing, see the shimmer of blood, or was it the alien fluid trailing down his legs? He wasn't just a leader. He was her colleague, her friend, and he was begging her to kill him. The console crackled, the system flickering erratically as the distortions consumed the last remnants of the facility. The walls pulsed with a sickly organic glow, veins of black fluid crisscrossing the metal like arteries in a living body. The creature stepped closer, its form twisting and reforming with every movement, an ever-shifting nightmare of limbs and void. Its presence wasn't just physical. It weighed on her mind, on her soul, pressing in with an incomprehensible alien will. She felt it probing, searching her thoughts, and she bit back a scream as her memories began to unravel under its gaze. Time fractured around her. One moment she was standing at the console, the next she was in the lab with Sophia's screams echoing in her ears. Then she was a child again, staring at the stars from her father's porch, her small hands gripping a telescope. The stars blinked out one by one as the creature's influence spread through her mind, erasing everything she was. "Focus," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "You have to focus." She grabbed the control lever and yanked it downward. A siren blared, louder than the creature's hum, shaking the walls. A countdown appeared on the screen, numbers ticking away in red. 0059, 0058, 0057. The creature reacted immediately. Its tendrils lashed out, striking the console, shattering the monitors in a spray of sparks. Lydia ducked, shielding her face as shards of glass rained down. The tendrils twisted toward her, and she rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding their grasp. They slammed into the floor where she had been standing, leaving behind a smoking crater. Elias let out a strangled cry, his body writhing as the creature tightened its hold. "Go!" he shouted, his voice echoing with an unnatural resonance. "Run!" But there was nowhere to run. The facility was crumbling around her, its walls bending and folding like paper. The black fluid spread across the floor, rising in waves that licked at her boots. Above her, the ceiling groaned as it began to collapse, revealing glimpses of the Arctic ice pressing in from above. She could hear the groan of pressure, the distant roar of the storm outside. The entire facility was on the verge of imploding. Lydia scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. The countdown continued. 0045, 0044, 0043. She had to buy time to keep the creature from stopping the overload. She grabbed a piece of shattered equipment, a jagged hunk of metal, and hurled it at the creature. It struck the void where its face should have been, and for a moment the creature hesitated, its form flickering. It turned toward her. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as the creature fixed its attention on her. The black tendrils surged forward faster than she could react, wrapping around her legs and pulling her toward it. She screamed, clawing at the floor, but the tendrils were too strong. They lifted her into the air, dragging her closer to the void. She could feel its hunger, its need to consume her, to turn her into another extension of its endless, incomprehensible self. "No!" she screamed, thrashing against its grip. "I won't let you win." In a final act of defiance, she reached for the small emergency flare clipped to her belt, a relic of a safety protocol no one had thought they'd need. She ignited it, the brilliant red light searing against the creature's shadowy form. It recoiled, its tendrils loosening just enough for her to fall free. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her leg, but she forced herself to crawl toward the console. The countdown was in its final seconds. 0010, 009. The creature roared, a sound that wasn't a sound at all, but a vibration that shattered the remaining glass and sent a wave of nausea crashing over her. It lunged toward the console, its massive form blotting out the light. Lydia threw herself forward, slamming her fist against the manual override just as the timer hit 001. The facility exploded in a cascade of light and sound. The containment sphere erupted, sending shards of Shard 9 hurtling in every direction. The creature let out one final, deafening roar as the energy surged through it, tearing its form apart. Tendrils of black fluid writhed and twisted, dissolving into nothingness as the fabric of reality collapsed around it. Lydia was thrown backward, her body slamming into the wall. She felt the searing heat of the explosion, the crushing force of the blast, and then nothing. When she opened her eyes, there was only silence. The lab was gone. The creature was gone. She lay in the snow, the Arctic wind howling around her. The remains of the Nova research facility were scattered across the ice, twisted metal and ash half buried in the snowdrifts. The sky above was dark, the stars obscured by heavy clouds. She tried to move, but her body refused. Her vision blurred, her breath shallow. She had done it. She had stopped the creature, destroyed Shard 9. But the cost? As her consciousness faded, she thought she heard something, faint whispers carried on the wind, voices too distant to understand. Her last thought was of the fragment they had taken from Shard 9, of the salvage team that would find it. She wanted to scream, to warn them, but the darkness took her before she could speak, and the whispers continued.